Good evening and a very warm welcome to you, to St Mary-le-Bow and to this Just Share event. For any of you who don't know about Just Share, it is an informal coalition of churches and NGOs really trying to keep the case for development economics in the eye of the city, and the City of London in particular, and also trying to keep alive the great tradition of Christian social and political thought. I am very conscious that there are many people working in the city, some doubtless here this evening, who are also very conscientious Christians. But not often at Just Share events do we have a very senior commercial and business figure able to talk about how he molds his faith into his work and his work into his faith. So I'm very grateful that Mark Hutchinson is here with us this evening. I first knew Mark 25 years ago when I was a student chaplain, though we haven't been in touch for all that period, but it's a particular delight to use this occasion to renew our friendship. And Mark has always been a very conscientious and thoughtful Christian, and he is a historian, which of course is a shortcut to thoughtfulness in my view. And of course, although a conscientious Christian, this didn't help him to get up in time for the 8:30 communion service when I was his student chaplain, but that may have had more to do with what I went on the previous evening, for all I know. And at one stage, I don't know if you remember this, we were both of us rather interested in a particular character called Conrad Noel. And Conrad Noel was the vicar of Thaxted in Essex. And he's a real epitome of how a practicing Christian minister can think very closely and thoughtfully about social justice. He actually ran his parish, and Thaxted is really a very large suburban and rural parish in Essex. He ran it like a socialist people's republic. And he got into a considerable amount of trouble for flying the red flag from the church's flagpole. There was a certain amount of eccentricity, but there was also a certain amount of Christian naivety and force behind it. Neither of us have followed Conrad Noel's path, but I think both of us would see that Christianity has an obvious implication for how commercial and social life are ordered. So Mark, as I say, is a graduate in history, and he's worked in business primarily in London since graduating. He's a former finance director with Saatchi & Saatchi and has been managing director of marketing services and management consulting businesses. He's now a partner in Ernst & Young's advisory practice in London, with responsibility for helping them to develop innovative new services and sources of growth. He's also a client service partner, advising a number of global multinationals on performance improvement initiatives. And he has run 20 marathons. The rest including a multi-stage 250-kilometer ultramarathon across the Sahara Desert. And that, for all I know, may be more interesting than anything else we're discussing this evening, so do feel free to ask him questions about that. He's going to speak now. We're then going to have a fairly free time to have questions, and then I hope that you'll be our guests at some fair trade refreshments in that corner of the church immediately afterwards. But I hand you over now to Mark.
Thank you, George, very much indeed. And please tell me if I'm talking too fast. I'm not used to speaking in such a hallowed halls. Well, look, thank you very much for coming to hear me this evening. I don't know where you've all come from to get here for 6:05, but no doubt many of you will have come from a place of work. You'll have worked on average 8 to 9 hours today, and you'll be returning there tomorrow for another stint. And so the days pass. Now, as you know, the title of my talk tonight is a Christian businessman, or businesswoman for that matter, an oxymoron. And you'll have seen from the blurb that I'm talking about the theology of work. Now, that's a rather highfalutin way of saying that I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own personal journey, which in many ways is very ordinary, and I hope you'll see a lot of commonality with yours, and in particular how I've come to think through what I do and understand how I fit as a Christian into the world of business. Now, I don't know how you ended up doing what you have done or the career that you pursued, but I'm slightly embarrassed to say that when I started applying for jobs at the beginning of my third year in college back in 1989, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. My college tutor had plenty of good ideas on my behalf, because while it was never publicly talked about, it was a truth universally acknowledged that he was a recruitment officer for the Secret Service. We never knew whether it was MI5 or MI6, and I'd always fancied the idea of becoming a spy. So when it came to my turn for the career discussion at the beginning of my third year, I was looking forward to what he had to say. "Well, Mark," he said in his rather reedy voice, "have you considered joining?" There was a long pause. I leant forward in my chair. "The church?" Well, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew it wasn't that. 26 years later, I'm a partner in the advisory practice at EY on the advisory leadership team. But circling back to 1989, I was in my final year studying history at Cambridge, as George has said. And as he's already told you, the reason you have the rather dubious honour of listening to me tonight is because he was my college chaplain. So I ended up joining one of the big 8 accounting firms, as it was KPMG, Pete Marwick, as it was then in 1990, on a training contract. But I hadn't given a great deal of thought to the decision. I'd taken double maths at A-level, was quite good at sums. I certainly knew I wanted to earn some money because of the overdraft I'd racked up as a student. And I had some vague familiarity with the world of accountancy because my father had sorted out work experience for me a couple of years before. So I applied to 2 firms, I got 2 offers, and I took up one of them. Now, when I look at the hoops that our graduates have to go through now to get even an interview at a firm like ours, it's vaguely embarrassing to compare my somewhat amateurish efforts. The internships, the extracurricular activities, the sheer enthusiasm and drive that they have to demonstrate. Anyway, so I started work in 1990, got my articles. Then over the next 18 and a half years, I had a variety of jobs. I was a finance director in advertising, managing director of a brand consultancy, set up the UK business for a US management consultancy before becoming a Big 4 partner in 2005. I had a busy life, I got married, had 3 children, moved house a few times, ran some marathons, read a lot of books. Life had its challenges, some very deep downs, some very real highs. But if you'd stopped me and asked me, why do you work where you work? Why do you do what you do? I would have struggled to have given you a good answer. The one thing I did know was that I was working to get myself to a position of financial security. I wanted to pay off my mortgage, have enough investment plans to pay for my children's schooling, have enough to get by. I didn't, and I don't, aspire to vast wealth, a yacht or a second home in the Caribbean, a flat in Kensington. But I did want to be financially independent, to be in a position where I could make choices, so that if I wanted to stop working and do something else, I could. And then by early 2009, I found that I was in that position. I could. I was in that privileged and rare position that I could now stop. And slightly counterintuitively, rather than this being a sense of relief and a sense of fulfillment, it was actually a cause of great stress and real soul-searching for me. If I'd been working until now to achieve this independence, this ability to choose, what now? What should I go and actually do? There's a whole other story to my life I could tell, but this coincided with a time when I was going through a strong period of renewal and recommitment, and I was earnestly seeking how to live out my life more actively as a Christian. For the previous decade at least, I'd found the demands of a busy job with lots of international travel, long hours, a young family, and the general busyness of life had got in the way of my faith. and I was just surviving, just getting through week by week. But after something of a personal crisis, I'd come back with a new and deeper commitment to my faith and a renewed knowledge of the grace of God and a desire to follow Jesus. So I started to do some proper thinking. I studied the scriptures, I took counsel, I met people, I researched. Now, my underlying assumption was that I would be leaving the world of business to go and do something else. I should have said earlier, I'm one of 4 children. My sister teaches at a Bible college, my younger brother's a school chaplain, my elder brother is a musician. So I'm very much the black sheep of the family by being in business. And it wouldn't have been at all of a surprise or exceptional in my family if I'd gone and pursued a more vocational route or traditionally vocational route. I should also add that I've had a long-standing interest in sub-Saharan Africa. I first visited Central Africa when I was 12. My sister has lived in Zambia, then Zimbabwe, then Uganda, and I've visited those countries and many others multiple times, and not just on safari holidays. Like many who visited that area often, I did, and still do, have a strong draw to the region, an undefinable sense of affinity. I've eaten sadza out of communal bowls in mud huts in the deep rural Zambia. I've held a little war orphan with cerebral palsy on my lap in a children's home in Sierra Leone, feeling my trousers get warm and damp as she wet herself continually. I've canoed the Zambezi, travelled the length of Malawi in the back of an open truck, eating samosas and sharing sweet tea with my fellow travellers. My heart has been moved, my imagination fired by books such as The Scramble for Africa, The Heart of Darkness, Things Fall Apart, and Makiwa. So I assumed that it was to Africa I would go, or at least with Africa I would be involved within the third sector. And rather arrogantly, I took the view that the world of NGOs, aid agencies, and charities would be falling over backwards to be able to have someone with my skills and experience coming to work for them. So I met the CEOs of 3 very well-known global agencies. I applied for a role as the head of Sub-Saharan Africa for another international agency that I'd seen advertised in The Economist. I met up with friends and contacts who'd worked in the world of aid and relief to get a better understanding of what they did and what I could do next. I had some very interesting conversations. I met some fascinating people, saw some very inspiring projects. But it wasn't becoming clear to me what I would then go and do. Strangely enough, 19 years working in a suit and tie in large multinational corporations didn't seem to be the most relevant experience that NGOs were looking for to run a region or a field or a project or even an NGO itself, large or small. And as part of my research, I'd been introduced to a man who runs an organization which specifically focuses on how businesses can get engaged with some of the biggest world global challenges. I asked him if he could come and meet me in my offices, which he agreed to. And in the first 5 minutes, he offered to pray for me. Now, this was the first time in my business life that a meeting had started with prayer. I talked him through what I was thinking about, and his answer was not what I expected at all. His response was, "Well, you should stay exactly where you are." As he put it to me, the trouble with businesses like yours is that you give money, you write the check, but as you write the check out, you're smudging it out with your arm at the same time. God uses businesses in good ways, but equally terrible things can happen in the pursuit of profit, often unwittingly. God, he said, needs Christians in business leadership. So that made me think. And I had to think through 2 major things. Firstly, that the world of business, this Western capitalist commerce, trade, this world of business is not necessarily something to escape from. It is the way of life for most of us, Christian or no. Secondly, that the world of business is not innately a bad thing. Many great evils in the world can be laid at the door of corrupt or unjust business practices, but much good can also spring from it. So I'm going to look through those 2 issues in some depth. So the first one, that the world is a world of work, of business, of trade, of commerce, and it is not necessarily something to escape from. Taking a biblical view, From the very earliest stories from ancient time in the Old Testament, the prevailing assumption is that mankind works. God's first instruction on the creation of man and woman was to fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the seas and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Abraham was a wealthy farmer. When he was called on a journey to the land God had intended for him, he didn't leave his farm, he took it with him, his family, his people, his livestock. Likewise, Isaac and Jacob were herdsmen, shepherds. They were prosperous, successful farmers. Jumping a few hundred years to the closing verses of Proverbs, there's an extraordinary passage about the wife of noble character. It's an unusual few verses to emerge from wisdom literature in such a patriarchal society. And in it, the lady is commended as one who gets up while it is still dark. She provides food for her family and portions for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable, and her lamp does not go out at night. And in the philosophical musings of the writer of Ecclesiastes, in his search for meaning, he says, "A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too I see is from the hand of God." Of course, there can be a dark side to this. Work can become so deeply satisfying and beguiling that it becomes all-consuming. How many marriages have been wrecked, parental relationships with children grown distant, sacrificed at the great altar of the god work? But at its heart, it should and can be a source of great satisfaction. Thus says the philosopher. So from Jacob to Joseph, from David to Daniel, they worked. It is true that some extremely significant Old Testament characters were called out of work to be nation makers, priests, prophets, Moses, Joshua, Samuel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. But these were the exceptions. The prevailing underpinning assumption to life was that one worked. Nothing fundamentally changes in the New Testament either. Albeit Jesus calls his disciples away from their daily work to follow him, this was not true of the vast majority of the cast of thousands that we tantalizingly glimpse through the histories and letters. Aeneas, who restored Saul's sight, Dorcas, the wealthy robe maker, the unnamed centurion with great faith, Cornelius the Gentile, Lydia the merchant. Even Paul, that brave, bold, itinerant apostle, was a tent maker. In Acts 18, Paul left Athens. He went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Later, in Ephesians, in a somewhat and sometimes misinterpreted passage, Paul calls on Christian slaves to obey their masters. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people. He was not specifically commenting on the justice of slavery, but on the calling to how you work. Again in Colossians, with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters. Now, I know I've gone into this at some length, but it was important for me to understand that as humans, as God's children, we work. That's what we do. I had been assuming that work was something I would escape from. I'd be called away to something else, but that's the exception. Rather than feeling slightly second best because I was working in business and that there must be a higher calling elsewhere, work is the backdrop to human life. The second point I had to work through was a slightly more complex one. While the world of work may be elemental to human existence, what about this Western profit-pursuing capitalist system in which I play a part? How do we square the circle of the greatest evils of rapacious capitalism and our parts as Christians within it? The evils it can bring are inescapable. From the 1,100 dead in a Bangladesh garment factory when the roof collapsed, to the untold millions killed in Central Africa, fueled by the demand for rare and precious commodities, to the lack of affordable vaccines to combat Ebola, to the rape of the Niger Delta, to to the loan shark on an estate in Manchester, to the foreclosed loan on a once proud family firm, and on and on and on. The Lord must look on and weep. So while so often these cruelties, evils and injustices have been over there, somewhere else, out of sight, there can't be one person in this room who in some shape or form has not felt some impact from the global fiscal crisis we've lived through these last 7 years, caused by a dramatic breakdown in accountability and ethics across the financial system. Only this last fortnight has the Archbishop of York published a new book critiquing many of the injustices in the way that the economy is currently run. And yet, going back to the New Testament, it's interesting to see how and when Jesus intervened in capitalism at work. 3 passages that particularly always strike me are when Jesus met Zacchaeus the tax collector, later when he turned the tables in the temple, and the parable of the rich fool. Zacchaeus' encounter with Jesus did not result in him stopping being a tax collector, but he did stop being corrupt. And he more than made good his wrongdoing. Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, he said. And if I've cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus' reaction wasn't stop being a tax collector, but today salvation has come to this house. The key drama in the passage is that Zacchaeus' life was transformed by his encounter with Jesus. He was still a tax collector, but now he was a Jesus-following tax collector. And when Jesus turned the tables in the temple, he described his Father's house as having been turned into a den of thieves. Worshippers were being charged extortionate amounts for sparrows and animals to sacrifice. It was those corrupt practices and abuse of the poor, worst of all in the temple precincts, that Jesus hated. And the final parable passage I wanted to turn to before coming back to my story is the parable of the rich fool in Luke 12. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. And when Jesus was telling that story, this would have been to an audience, to listeners who believed that God blessed people through great wealth. So they would have seen that as a very commendable story to be telling about a successful rich man. But how does Jesus go on? He says, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. Gulp. To me, this is one of the passages in the Bible which speaks most directly to those of us who work in this city or in business today. You fool, how easy it is to build barns, then tear them down and build bigger ones. So this leaves the challenge. If it's not business per se that's evil, but evil and corrupt practices, injustice, abuse of the poor, how do we turn our own metaphorical tables? How can we engage with business in a positive way for the purposes of God's kingdom, rather than just for the accumulation of wealth for others or for ourselves? And in particular, in my case, as I was asked that question, for myself in Africa. So as I was trying to answer this question for myself 6 years ago, one book was particularly influential on my thinking. It's called Wars, Guns and Votes by Paul Collier, who's a former World Bank economist. He also wrote The Bottom Billion, which some of you may well know. His contention is that the poorest nations are structurally insecure and will continue to experience a cyclical return to endemic poverty and civil war without sustainable economic growth. This, in turn, needs the 3-legged stool of the rule of law, of healthcare and education, but as important, stimulus for economic growth through good business, access to capital, good business practices, responsible employment, all have a key role to play in helping get those countries out of structural poverty. So as I thought through what I should be doing next, it made me realize I may not be an expert on good governance or in healthcare or education, but I am a businessman. What role could I play in helping stimulate and support economic growth in the poorest nations in Africa? Would this mean leaving my work and going somewhere else, or staying where I am and doing something else? So praying this through over many weeks and months, I concluded that I had two important but complementary roles to play. Firstly, to my slight surprise, I should stay within the world I worked in, to play my part as a Christian within the place of work. I recognize that as a Christian business leader, or one of them, I have a responsibility that goes with that, to be a positive influence in the workplace, on the leadership teams of which I'm a member, with the people who work for me and with me, with my clients. Secondly, I concluded, I need to engage more actively as a businessman in Africa, and ideally find a way to combine the two. So I'm going to talk a bit first how I've engaged outside my workplace, before coming back to the daily challenges of being a Christian working in business. And for me, it's been a fascinating journey. To give you some examples, I visited some microfinance organizations in Sierra Leone, and off the back of some of the people I met there, became a founder investor in a venture capital business that aims to stimulate startups across that region. Its vision is to return a significant degree of its profits back into the country it operates in and plough them back into more startups and ventures. Now, that business has become pretty successful. It's raised significant funds and is now constructing 2 hydro dams and a solar farm across West Africa, creating employment for thousands. I'm also involved with an organization called Great Lakes Outreach, or GLOW, in Burundi. GLOW does many things, but one among them, it's raised funds and constructed a hotel and conference center in Bujumbura, the capital of Burundi, all the profits of which fund the Scripture Union operations in that country. And most recently, is trying to raise another $1.5 million to extend the hotel and conference center, increase the income for Scripture Union, and create more employment and role model good Christian practices more thoroughly, and reducing the dependency on aid and on donations. I'm not here to raise funds tonight, but I'm very happy to talk to any of you about that afterwards if you're interested. Now, at the moment, we're exploring different funding models for that 1.5 million. We're looking at how we can reach out to high net worth Christians who would consider loaning rather than giving on a low interest basis towards the hotel's construction. We'd then underwrite half the loan from future fundraising and a portion of the hotel profits. Now, GLOW is also advising a dairy business that provides loan-backed cattle to farmers to stimulate the local economy and provide income through selling milk. Time permitting, I'm looking to see how I can help there too. I'm also involved with 5 Talents, which is the Anglican Church's very own microfinance charity. In fact, my wife's just become one of their trustees. And there they're trying to grow and stimulate micro savings rather than microfinance across Africa. I've been able to host events for them and support them financially. And what's excited me is I can get involved in a wide range of related things. And in a rather clunky business language kind of way, it gives me leverage. I can provide advice, funding, investment sometimes, and by effectively playing a non-executive role, I can help a broad number of organizations despite only having limited time available. I can play a small part in getting power into Sierra Leone, milk into the mouths of children, and schools funded in Burundi, savings banks started in southern Sudan, where either my financial help, my moral support, or my advice and my prayers can all help. All of these organizations are strong on accountability, strong on training of the workforce in the country, and grounded in Christian ethics and in a vision of seeing God's kingdom extended here and now. I'm not telling you these things to kind of brag or boast about what I'm doing, but just to kind of help you capture a slight vision of what the art of the possible is. And what about day-to-day in the workplace? Now, I have had an opportunity to do some proactively Africa-related things. I'm running a pro bono engagement in conjunction with a client, looking at building a waste recycling unit in Uganda. It's interesting, but the reality is on a day-to-day basis, my workload's pretty intense, my time is limited. But to me, there are 5 key principles that I try to take into work. And I would emphasize that, like everyone, I don't get all of these right all of the time. Firstly, I remind myself daily that I'm there for a reason. Like everyone, I have good days and bad days. Last Friday morning at 7 a.m. when it was -6 degrees on Guildford Station, I wasn't feeling particularly positive about work. There are times when it's tough, when I find myself playing mind games. How long before I can stop? But praying into the day, into the meetings coming up, into the challenges or stressful things I find myself doing or situations I find myself in, helps. I remember that when I prayed and looked into what I should do 6 years ago, the answer came back loud and clear that I should stay within the world of business. So on those days when I feel I'm just hanging in there, I remember that, and it alters my perspective. My work is a massive privilege, and it's stimulating and exciting, but at times it feels a heavy responsibility, and it feels stressful and pressured. But I thank God that He's put me there, and I seek out opportunities to be a voice of influence in the future of my firm. My second principle is that if I'm to be a Christian at work, I mustn't be an anonymous Christian. Now, I'm fortunate that I work for a firm that is very open-minded rather than conformist, but the prevailing culture is largely a-religious. Being a Christian at work is therefore an opportunity, but I also have to remind myself daily that I'm therefore held accountable to God for how I behave, for my language, for my integrity, my ethics, and also how and when I talk about my beliefs and their impact on my life. Effectively, as a partner in the firm, I'm on the public stage. Principle 3 is to seek out opportunities to role model Christian love and fellowship. Work does get busy, and I have to actively remind myself to take the time out to care for and show concern for those I work with. Am I good at this? I don't know. But I do know I'd be a lot worse if I wasn't actively trying to do it. Just last week, a young man who works for me asked to see me. He's having a hard time in his marriage, has been travelling a lot, and the problems have been building up. He was very nervous about talking to me to ask if he could work from home more and maybe go down to part-time for a while. But this was an opportunity to be able to show him love, concern, and support. And it turned out much more than he was expecting me to be giving. Principle 4 is to use the financial rewards from work wisely and well. Often I have to remind myself of the foolish man building his barns. It's not always about giving money away, although this is a biblical principle and can be an amazing blessing for those organizations or people to whom you donate or give, but also an opportunity to look at more creative ways, such as the hotel in Burundi, the West African sustainable energy business I mentioned earlier as well. Before I looked into these things properly a few years ago, I had no idea of the range of possibilities. I feel in many ways I'm hardly scratching the surface, and there's so much more I could be doing. But I know God wants me working in business, and when it comes to the end of my life, I want to hear the Lord say, "Well done, you good and faithful servant," like the men who were given the 5 and 10 talents by their master. Which brings me to my final principle. Keep it proportionate. There's so much more to life than just work. God has called me to work, yes, but He's also called me to be a father, a friend, a husband. There have been times when it's felt like it's all getting on top of me, but then I pray that God will help me hold these things lightly. It's stimulating, demanding, a fantastic privilege, but it's also just a job. Sometimes it's helpful to remind myself of that. There's a senior partner in a big city firm whose common practice was to send out an email every time a retired partner died to the other partners to tell them. It got to a stage when he was sending out an email every couple of weeks. I'm sorry to tell you that John Smith has died. He was 62. His funeral is next Thursday. Or Fred Jones has died. He was 59. Email after email after email. All these partners had worked hard all their life. I didn't know them. I didn't know their aspirations, but all of them would have been expecting to live a long, fulfilled, and wealthy retirement. A retirement that kept on finding these emails people for whom it had ended after just a small handful of years. After a while, that senior partner decided to stop sending out the emails because they just came out too frequently. As I say, this isn't a comment on those partners who died, but for you and for me, don't be one of those people who wait for their life to start when they retire. Life's for living now. Thank you.
You.
Well, you do us a great honour by sharing your faith and your working life so personally and so humanely and so thoroughly, and we're really grateful to you.
So I hope it wasn't too thorough.
It was excellent. So this is an opportunity for us to ask questions, and Tricia has a microphone for you to use. I've got a number of questions, and perhaps I'll just take the privilege of starting with one. You were speaking about, at an early stage, about how you engaged at the period where you were having a break, as it were, in your career, and you were thinking about engaging with the charitable sector. Do you think that the charitable sector, particularly that part of it that is engaged with the developing world, is somewhat endemically opposed to business and to growth and to capitalism, or do you find that it can be a really good partner for the developing world?
Yeah, so I think it depends is my slightly on the hedge answer on that. So business and the sort of the third sector, they really speak a different language. And in many ways, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd have said they're completely diametrically opposed. There's a great gap between the two. I would say that has changed significantly. There are some business people who've gone into leadership positions in NGOs, but I think they're always surprised at the level of emotional stress that goes with a role like that, from the people I know. But you also see active attempts by NGOs to engage in different way with businesses, and also businesses engaging in different ways with NGOs. So I'm thinking of things like the Oxfam have now set up a venture fund.
Indeed.
Save the Children is looking at different business models to engage with business. I mean, there are many, many, many. So I think there's that. In the old days, business played the lipstick on a pig game. If I'm exaggerating, I'm kind of exaggerating to make the point. Let's do things that look good so we can talk about them and make people think we're, doing the right things. I think that's changed. You see some large businesses really actively engaging in different ways around projects and investment, etc. And I think for NGOs, some see business as bad, but others see it as an opportunity to either access talent or funding.
That's very helpful. Any questions? You'd like to ask something? Sir, the trick with the microphone is to hold it virtually put it in your mouth, and then it works. If you don't, it won't.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting and helpful. I was wondering, what's been the response of your perhaps non-Christian colleagues and partners at EY to the way that you've sought to live out your Christian faith in your business life?
Well, so, this isn't an advertorial for EY, but it's a very supportive environment. The purpose at the heart of EY is building a better working world. And that suffuses many, many things that, as a firm, it does. So there's no, I said it's a-religious. I think it is a-religious, and that it's not specifically, any particular religion or set of beliefs at its heart. But it's, we have an active CU. Some people are here tonight. And the guy who runs that was speaking at a Building Better Working World event around what we as Christians believe. There's lots of opportunities within the firm to be open about being a Christian. So I think it's seen as a net positive rather than negative.
And would you actually say that at any stage in your business life that your Christian faith has caused you to challenge a decision or a process or a relationship or an outcome and name it as such?
Yes. Yeah, without wishing to go into any detail. But yeah, no, I would definitely say that. Not since I've been at EY, but yes, in the past.
Probably not necessary at EY. Right. And how did you do that? Just said it.
Just say it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm fairly straight talking.
And how many people what sort of proportion of people do you feel would feel confident to do that? in the business world? I mean, is it difficult to do? Or?
Well, so as I mentioned earlier, I was a finance director in an advertising agency for a while. And that industry, so it's not comment on the company I work for, but that industry, I think it would be quite difficult because the prevailing worldview is a very liberal one. I mean, liberal in a broadest sense, sort of, and actually intolerant liberal. Whereas in the sort of professional services world, I think it is different, just the culture's different.
Questions?
I saw a book, What Went Wrong with Development Economics. I haven't read it, I saw the title.
Just a bit louder, if you would.
What Went Wrong with Development Economics, that was the title of a book. And I'm thinking about business models, I'm thinking about art, science. Just seen an advert on inside the Tube for a nutmeg, invest without bankers. So a whole range of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, there's some fascinating, once you start reading up, there's so many interesting books. I mean, a couple I'd recommend. One is called Dead Aid by Dan Moyo, who's an ex-economist from Goldman Sachs, so you can kind of guess her perspective. But her contention is that government-to-government aid has destroyed Africa. Yeah. And there's too many easy, celebrity-led small projects which actually don't get understanding the dynamics of local economy. So her recommendation in this book was to just stop aid altogether. Just slightly Malthusian, but you can see where she's coming from. But equally, then you have, books like Poor Economics are very interesting, and Bottom Billion I mentioned earlier by Paul Collier, where it's more around how do you stimulate economic growth, and you can use some aid money and some skills from aid agencies to help do that. But aid on its own ultimately creates dependency, which I think I would believe in.
I mean, that's going to be a hot topic in the election campaign.
Sure.
Unmistakably. Anything else? Sir.
Mark, you spoke about the pastoral care that you'd offer to a colleague in the workplace. That seemed to be one opportunity where you could do something for them. How do you handle the perhaps more challenging situations of, say, handling performance cases, making people redundant, and so on? Do you find that a difficult conflict to reconcile?
Yes, so I've done that often. I think, so my approach, and I have had this feedback, so again, not trying to say anything positive, but it's just to be very straight talking with people. So, kind of compassionate in listening hard, but also not shying away from being clear with someone. And I sometimes wonder, actually, in our world, particularly it's a very English thing, is to avoid a difficult conversation, and ultimately that can just be worse because people don't then understand why they've had a poor performance rating or why they haven't had the pay rise or why they're not getting the opportunities. And because people, to avoid a difficult conversation, have sort of not given the message, but just people have seen the consequence of those decisions. So I think as a Christian, we owe it to people to be clear and straight, not in a hard way, but clear.
There is a strand of kind of devotional theology around these days, which can be that successfulness in career and rewards and the regard of other people is a sign of God's blessing. Where would you stand?
So I'm not a prosperity gospel man at all.
Plainly not. Plainly not. So would you say it was not the gospel?
I would say that's not the gospel. I
Amen.
would say that's very specifically not the gospel.
I wasn't suggesting I was spotting it. I just wondered what your reaction.
No, I think so. I mean, I think good practices that come well from someone's faith and how they live their faith out can lead to successful business outcomes. Yeah. But that's very different from saying one is a response to the other, because they don't always.
Hi, Mark. Thank you very much for what you were talking about earlier. I work in EY as well, so it's very encouraging to know someone in a leadership team like
Is
yourself.
everyone from EY here? Is it a big
It's
outfit?
a few. It's a small.
Is it just a few people, or I don't know how many it is?
65.
I've had some opportunities to talk to some Christian businessmen, and they were talking about something called a triple bottom line. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it covers, you're looking at profit not only from a monetary front, but also from a social and also environmental. And then I spoke to other businessmen, Christian businessmen. They went as far as to say there's a quadruple bottom line, and the additional one is the spiritual element of it. Because as Christian businessmen, they want to bring that gospel, but obviously bringing the gospel to different countries, taking into account there is real business substance in what they do as well. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how this quadruple bottom line, does that fit into this Christian businessman? And in your experience, you know, and your experiences in Africa, has that happened?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose I've not particularly thought of it in that way myself, but I think part of the good business practice is recognizing the social contract that you have as a business with all your stakeholders, whether it's your employees or your clients, but equally your supply chain, the government, and the countries in which you work, the tax you pay, and so on and so forth. So the social contract, I think, is very true. And I wouldn't necessarily say that's a Christian principle. I think that's just a good moral principle. But the bit then sort of taking it further, which say that as Christians, what can take, what role can we play in taking our businesses beyond delivering on a social contract? Yeah, I actually hadn't really thought about it. I think it's more the impact of those individuals who are Christians in the business than the business itself, I think, having a spiritual contract. I'm not so sure about that.
I mean, a Christian tradition, certainly Catholic social teaching in the Roman Catholic Church and to some extent the Anglican Communion, would reinforce the idea that the social contract is really about advancing the common good.
Yes.
And I wonder how you see businesses committing themselves to the common good.
Well, so I mentioned this venture capital business. It's now an energy business in Africa. And I think for me, that's a good example. And the reason they won the contract to construct a hydro dam above Freetown is because the president, he'd never heard of them, but he really liked the vision that they brought, which is that profit stays in the country. Okay. And so many, all the others, Chinese manufacturer, construction firms, Italian, they all basically go and build it and then take the money out of the country again. And so this whole social contract becomes a much, kind of like a sustainable rolling benefit way beyond the employment you create and the provision of a hydro dam, but also then the next set of businesses that get funded out of that profits. And I think it's sort of that rolling effect that gets created. I think that's where it really comes to play.
I just wanted to ask two questions, really. The first is, I presume you've got a very demanding job as a partner at EY, so how do you stop that job from encroaching into all the hours that there are available? And secondly, once you've done that, how do you then balance what you're doing for these various projects in Africa against other responsibilities to your home church, to your family, and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I don't sleep.
You never did, though, Paul.
No.
I mean, you didn't sleep at all,
I
remember you.
I don't need a huge amount of sleep, which is helpful. No, joking apart. So to answer your first question, for me, it's about putting time bars around things. So I think in a role like mine, I'd probably role for anyone's, there's something about saying there are finite times when I work and when I don't work. So don't bother emailing me at the weekend, because I won't even read it till Monday morning. I don't take calls. I don't take my BlackBerry, smartphone now, on holiday with me, so I'm not contactable. My secretary has my number, but no one else. So there's something about, when you're not working, you're not working. And people know that. People who work with me know that, so they don't bother contacting me on a Sunday afternoon because they won't be able to. So there's something about that, I think, time bars. There's also, I talked about this thing about keeping it proportionate at the end, and there's something about holding your work slightly lightly, which I know is difficult. I find that difficult at times, but it's about not letting it mentally encroach as well as physically encroach, and kind of keeping it within its box. So there's that. But it's still long hours. And it means, so weekends, I've got 3 kids, they're all school age. I've got sports matches. I like to go for a run. They never clear their rabbits out, so I have to do that for them, and. So it's just a matter of managing the time. It all seems to get fitted in somehow.
Yeah.
Oh, and I go out with my wife for a meal once a week, just the 2 of us. That's important.
There was another question, I can't remember. Who was that? Sir, yes. And then And then perhaps a last question with you, sir? Or no, three. Perhaps we'll have these three questions together.
Yeah, fine.
Radical. So if you would like to start, and then...
Is it possible to consider an economics that doesn't depend on the notion of growth?
Could you just slightly closer to your mic?
Sorry. Is it possible to consider an economics that doesn't depend on the notion of growth as crucial, given that possibly the resources of this planet are finite?
Thank you. And then the gentleman at the back.
What do you say to your colleagues when they ask you, what's this Christian business all about?
Hello, Christopher Mason. I apologize for being late. Ironically, one of the things I do is I care for an ex-banker who suffers with dementia. So all his writing work is as of nothing because he's got dementia. My question was, if I imagine that I'm a director of an international pharmaceutical company, and I'm out there marketing drugs, say antidepressants, and I'm running a campaign, paying lots of money to some specialists to go all over the world to talk up that antidepressant and not talk it down. If I'm going into chemist shops and finding out what doctors are prescribing, in fact, if I'm just indulging in corrupt practices. Now, if I have a Damascene experience, how do I handle that?
Excellent questions. Can you craft those into one beautiful, comprehensive answer?
Well,
and because it's the end of the evening,
sure,
something
briefly,
brief, but also such that it's so memorable that nobody will ever forget.
Okay.
I'm going to take that glass.
Thanks for that challenge.
It's making me very nervous.
So on the growth point, I think growth, it's a fascinating challenge because growth is a key dynamic for business. Pursuit of growth, more profit, creates more opportunity, more capital that you can reinvest, more employment, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, we are an energy and resource hungry world, and the more growth, the more we consume. So, you know, there are views on either side, aren't there, that if you read some of the things like in Super for Economics, you can see that there's a whole dynamic around R&D and research, which is meaning that you can grow and become less resource intensive rather than more. So I think there's a positive growth dynamic. There's also a negative growth dynamic where you do just consume more and more and more. So I think growth, or a desire to grow, is an unavoidable truth of business in the way that requiring oxygen is an unavoidable truth of being human. So therefore the challenge is, how do you channel that growth into a productive way rather than in a resource-starving way? Which brings me on to the second question. They're not really at all related, are they? But a Christian at work. So I don't go around saying I'm a Christian at work. You know, I don't have a badge. I don't wear a cross. But, you know, a member of the Christian network. This talk was publicized widely. I make no secret of it. I say when I go to New Wine, this Christian festival in summer, that's where I've been. You know, it's no. So I've never. I suppose people have always known. So it's never been. And I did, when I started at EY, I felt it was very important for me to quite publicly let it be known from the beginning. And to this point about being held to account, which I talked about in my talk, I think that's important. That helps me as well to make sure that I kind of follow through on that. The last point, the Damascene experience. I think there are business practices and business environments where it's not healthy to be as a Christian. And there are some ways of the world which people say that's just the way it is. If you want to be in this, this is what you do. If you're doing work in the Middle East, you've got to pay a bribe. There's no allegation, I'm just talking about kind of what people say. So, and as a Christian, you have to say, well, I won't. You know, it's interesting, I was in Nigeria a while ago, and I met up with the chief executive of the Nigerian division of a multinational company that you will all know. And I said to him, you know, Nigeria's, you know, very, business practices are kind of all over the place. And I said to him, what happened? How do you cope with it? And he said, you know what, for our business, the very first time we pay a bribe, we're finished. Because as soon as we pay one bribe, it'll be like wildfire around the business that we pay bribes. And then the bribes get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So we just always say no. And that's Nigeria, and it's a perfectly successful business. So there are ways through it, but there are things which we just, as Christians, cannot do. Is that a down note to end on?
No, I think it's an extremely positive and authentic note to end on. And we're vastly in your debt for your candor and the sympathetic way in which you expressed your faith and brought it out of your experience. So I think we are bound to thank Mark enormously.